like you, be strong to hold the powers of the sun. To dream, believe.
Let's listen to Pavarotti.
Only one.
Hello, welcome to The Revealing. I am your host, Pavarotti, and I'm here to discuss a very, very important aspect of this Idaho 4 case. And you know what? I'm going to ask a couple of questions in this one, and I would appreciate your response. And just to let you know, this video, it's not really for all of the people that follow me regularly, comment regularly. I know you folks have a ton of common sense and you can see the light. This video is for all of those people out there that I know watch my videos. Most of them do, every single one, hang on every word. They won't ever say anything, but you know that they do. And they're either so obtuse or their guilter block is so big, or even now there's a new term, it's called the POV block. You know, they hate POV so much that it makes their common sense go out the window and it just blocks them from seeing things. But whether they're just dense, they got a guilter block, a POV block, or they're just lying to themselves, this one is really for them, because I'm going to show you some things in this video that there's no way that even if you have guilter blocks, POV blocks, there's no way, unless you are really just dense, that's the only way, that you can deny the information that I'm about to bring to you. So in this one, we're going to discuss again, because I gave everybody an assignment a while back. I said, go out and study that federal grand jury investigation. Study it. Because that's the thing that's the key to this whole case, and it's not right. And remember, you have two separate entities between the federal grand jury investigation and that little state grand jury that was convened that indicted Bryan Kohberger. They're not the same thing, folks, so you got to understand that, number one. And that's the first thing you have to understand, because that is the first bait and switch that they use in this entire scenario to keep you off guard, to keep you off the topic. They did the federal grand jury investigation that we didn't find out about until court hearings, where it slipped out here and there. And the state grand jury that convened to convict Bryan Kohberger has been blasted everywhere. So whenever the issue of the federal grand jury investigation comes up, they just kind of slide you to that state grand jury as a bait and switch and get you to quit thinking about it. But don't quit thinking about it, because that is the key to this case, I assure you. And it is also, as I'm going to show you in this video, the key to POV's entire investigation, because it practically proves it, okay? But we're going to get into this, and this one goes out really, like I said, to all of the guilter block having, POV block having, dense individuals out there that want to try to rationalize this federal grand jury investigation. If you watch this video with an open mind, take your guilter block, take your POV block, try not to be dense, and just keep an open mind, and you watch every bit of this video, at the end, I guarantee you there's no way you can come to any other conclusion than what that grand jury was convened to investigate. Follow along, please. Okay, the first question for the survey is, law enforcement states day one that this is a targeted attack. Okay, we all know this. In each of the targeted rooms, one of the victims has a parent that just had major drug charges reduced for working as a confidential informant. Now, you know that law enforcement knows this very quickly. If you are the investigators in this case yourself, and you have this information and you put out to the public that it's a targeted attack and nobody else is in danger, as an investigator in this case, where do you focus your efforts on? And answer this one honestly. Do you go to A, the frat boys and their ex-boyfriends, or do you go to B, thugs involved in organized drug crimes? Answer that question honestly with that information. Because I can tell you, you all wonder why they cleared the frat boys and the ex-boyfriends so fast in this case. And that right there, if you answer that question honestly and correctly, should give you your answer. But we're going to hold that until the end, and we'll ask that question again, because we're going to take a look at some other things involved in this case, which is the federal grand jury investigation. A federal grand jury is convened after a federal investigation begins or a federal complaint is filed. The grand jury is made up of 16 to 23 citizens who are sworn in and given investigative powers, such as the ability to issue subpoenas and compel witnesses to testify. The grand jury then hears testimony and considers evidence in cases brought to it by the United States Attorney, not the local attorney, the U.S. Attorney. The Investigative Assistance for Violent Crimes Act, IAVCA of 2012, defines mass killings as the murder of 3 or more people in a single incident. This act also allows federal law enforcement agencies to assist state and local governments with investigating violent crimes in public places that are not federal. So, does the fact that it was a mass killing allow them to convene a federal grand jury for an investigation? And the answer is no. A federal grand jury cannot be convened to investigate a state crime that is being investigated by the FBI due to the Investigative Assistance for Violent Crimes Act, IAVCA, if that crime does not violate federal law. So just the act of killing someone does not violate federal law. Just the act of killing several people does not violate federal law. It will allow for the assistance of the FBI to participate in the investigation, but it will not allow them to convene a federal grand jury, because a federal grand jury can only investigate potential federal crimes. Even if the FBI is involved in the investigation, if the state crime does not violate a federal statute, a federal grand jury cannot be used to probe that aspect of the case. These are not my words, folks. These are the words. So, just committing a murder of several people does not violate federal law. So even though the FBI is allowed to help due to IAVCA in the investigation, a federal grand jury cannot be convened to investigate the crime. It has to be a federal crime. Now, a federal grand jury investigation was convened to investigate the Idaho 4 atrocity because they believed a federal crime was committed. These are my words. Remember, to convene a federal grand jury investigation, it must be believed that federal laws have been broken. Now, we've got to understand this key point right here. The federal grand jury was convened prior to the December 23rd AT&T warrant that was issued for BCK's phone. And we know that because the court record states that the warrant was a copy and paste from Brett Payne from the federal subpoena that was issued. So that means that this federal grand jury was convened prior to December 23rd when they issued the AT&T warrant. Now, let's talk about federal crimes, because this has to be a federal crime to convene a federal grand jury. They have to have suspicion that it's a federal crime. Now, a federal crime that can be investigated by a federal grand jury is any criminal act that violates a U.S. federal law, including offenses like large-scale fraud, interstate drug trafficking, terrorism, cybercrime that crosses borders, bank robbery, or any crime committed on federal property, which means a federal prosecutor would need to present evidence to the grand jury to pursue charges against the suspect. Now let's talk about these federal crimes. And does any of these apply to the Idaho 4 case? How about large-scale fraud? Well, who knows with this group of folks running this town, but we can clarify that no, it doesn't appear that fraud was involved in the Idaho 4 unalivings. How about interstate drug trafficking? Any crime that involves drugs, including murder, is considered a federal crime. That one gets you in there immediately because drugs are a federal crime. So any kind of crime involving drugs is considered federal, and you can convene a federal grand jury immediately. Terrorism, no, it doesn't seem to apply in the Idaho 4 case. Now, I had one of my trolls actually try to debunk the federal grand jury by saying that they convened it for cybercrime that crosses the borders. And their their dissertation was for cyber stalking, right? Now we know in court that they've already said there's no connection to the victims from Bryan Kohberger. So that would include cyber stalking. But you knew that Bryan Kohberger never stalked the victims, didn't you? That includes cyber stalking when he says there was no stalking. So cyber surveilling is not cyber stalking, by the way, because as they went through trying to debunk it using the cyber stalking, they did a pretty good job of explaining the rules involved in cyber stalking. And then they debunked themselves with their own little video, but then they didn't acknowledge it at the end, that cyber surveilling is not considered cyber stalking. And by the way, if there's no connection to the victims, how would they have even known that there was cyber stalking that could have been happening? That one is idiotic. And then last is a crime committed on federal property. And no, some people have tried to justify that off-campus housing, because the university is receiving federal grants, then that would make the off-campus housing part of the federal university grant program. Sorry, no. Off-campus housing is just what it states. Off-campus housing. It's just a house. Has nothing to do with the university. And even if it did, just because the university receives federal grant money does not make the university a federal property, okay? So no. Interstate drug trafficking, yes. Keep going. Now, for a unaliving to be considered federal, the act must cross state lines, but not just simply cross state lines, okay? You can be a Pullman resident, drive into Moscow, Idaho, and unalive somebody, and that is not a federal crime. The only way crossing a state line becomes a federal crime, if you do your actual studying on this, is if one, it is a murder for hire. If you're hired in one state to commit a murder in another state, and you cross the state line to do it, bam, you got a federal crime right there. So a federal grand jury could be convened to investigate it. Or two, you unalive somebody in Moscow and then you drive their body over into Pullman, Washington. Now you've crossed the state lines in the process of committing an unaliving, so you just committed a federal crime. Just driving over the state line and killing somebody is not federal, okay? But even if it was, I'm going to prove to you in this, it would not apply to what we're discussing with this federal grand jury. Now let's go back to this timeline real quick, because we know now that more than 71 federal subpoenas were issued in the Idaho 4 investigation by the federal grand jury. We know that the first AT&T warrant filed on December 23rd, 2022 by Brett Payne was a copy and paste from a federal subpoena, which means the federal grand jury was convened prior to that. Now I want you to really think, because this is what seems to be just glaringly obvious to me, but glaringly blocked out of these other people's minds. How long does it take to put together a federal grand jury panel to investigate if there wasn't one already investigating? You see, these people just think that this federal grand jury is just is sitting around waiting. They're federal employees. Okay, we need a grand jury. Y'all go jump in your seats. That is not how a federal grand jury is operated. That's not where they come from. And let's dive in a little bit deeper, shall we? A federal grand jury investigation is a preliminary criminal investigation conducted by a group of citizens, okay? A group of citizens, not state and federal employees, to determine if there's enough evidence to indict someone for a serious federal crime. What is the purpose of this federal grand jury investigation? That is interesting. A grand jury's role is to prevent prosecutorial misconduct and ensure that there is sufficient evidence to pursue a prosecution. So the federal grand jury's main purpose is to prevent prosecutorial misconduct. So while they're investigating the case because they don't want the prosecutor to do things that he's not supposed to, and this is the fail-safe for that. Now, a grand jury investigation involves receiving evidence from the government attorney, the court, or a member of the grand jury, issuing subpoenas like those 71 that were issued. And those subpoenas are to either compel witnesses to testify and obtain documents, hearing testimony and considering evidence, and then finally deciding whether to issue an indictment or true bill. That is a federal indictment or true bill. In this case, there was no federal indictment or true bill issued by this federal grand jury. And you can go look at that Luigi Mangione case, and you can see that the feds are already indicting him. They're taking over. If it's a federal case, the feds will jump in first, take it over, and prosecute it because they have a 95% conviction rate. They won't let the states mess with it. This one, after the federal grand jury finished, they did not find enough evidence to indict on a federal level. A grand jury is made up of 16 to 23 citizens. Now look at this. They're randomly selected from the federal judicial district. Now that means the federal judicial district of Idaho, in the area that the grand jury is convened, they pull citizens randomly selected from that area. Now imagine finally the grand jury proceedings are private. Okay, now think about this for a second, folks. Imagine you're a citizen of the District of Idaho, Federal District of Idaho in that area, and you're going about your daily life. You're going to work. You've got kids. You've got responsibilities. You've got obligations. And then all of a sudden, you are contacted by the federal government to be pulled into a process to be part of a federal grand jury investigation, because these are random citizens. Does that mean that you pick up from everything you're doing and drop it all, and then the next day you go sit in the seat and you start investigating? Is that how that process works? No, you would be right to assume not. Let's talk about it. The typical process to select prospective jurors, serve them a summons, and then select jurors for a federal grand jury investigation can take several weeks, depending on the court's workload, with the initial selection of potential jurors from a pool happening relatively quickly, followed by a qualification questionnaire, and then the actual selection process, which may take a few days once the individuals appear in court. Now, let's talk about what we just read right there, because it gives us key points to remember. Potential jurors are chosen randomly from voter registration lists or other sources. So let's see how this process works. Now, they've decided that a federal law may have been broken, so they're going to convene a federal grand jury to investigate. What's their first step? Is a random selection. Potential jurors are chosen randomly from voter registration lists or other sources. I would imagine this random selection would include more than 16 to 23 members because there is a vetting process that must take place. So how many do they actually randomly select? Who knows? Maybe it's 100, maybe it's 200. Then the next step is qualification questionnaire. Once they randomly select these individuals, they receive a questionnaire to verify their eligibility to serve on the federal grand jury. Now, does that mean that they are randomly selected and then they come in and sit down and then they're handed this questionnaire to verify eligibility to expedite the process? No, because the next step is a court appearance for those that are deemed qualify, that will be summoned to appear in court for the final selection process. So what does that tell us? That qualification questionnaire is mailed to them, folks. Now, we know how the mail system works, right? If they mail it one day, they certainly aren't going to get it the next day, probably not the day after that. That's probably several days there. So now we've got the process of selecting the jurors. Then we're going to send them qualification questionnaires in the mail. There's another few days. The individuals receive the questionnaire. You know there's a deadline for them to answer it and get it back to them. And that deadline's not going to be that day. It's probably several more days. So they fill out the questionnaire, and then what do? They carry it down there? No, they're probably going to mail it back to them. There's another couple of days. Now, then they go in for a court appearance. Those deemed qualified will be summoned to appear in court for the final selection process, right? And remember what it says up here? Followed by a qualification questionnaire, and then the actual selection process, which may take a few days once individuals appear in court. So by the time they appear in court, this is already taken dang near 2 weeks or more. Then they do appear in court, and then we got a few more days for the qualification process, because the first thing is going to be the voir dire. During the selection process, potential jurors may be questioned by the court and attorneys to identify any biases. And then the federal grand jury typically consists of 16 to 23 members in the end. So this process can take several weeks, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that this was so important that they somehow expedited everything they could expedite in this several weeks, which is probably more like a month. Let's say they did it in 2 weeks, which you know did not happen. But let's just say, for the lack of argument, that they did it in 2 weeks because they were really fast and focused. How could they have any evidence that someone crossed the state lines? Because I know everybody still goes back to that, well, he crossed the state line to do it. Well, how could they have any evidence that someone crossed the state lines to commit the Idaho atrocity on December 9th, 2022? Because if the AT&T, this is best case scenario, December 9th, because on December 23, when they filed the AT&T warrant, we know they already had the federal subpoena filed for that warrant. So at best, December 23, probably quite a bit before that. On December 9th, that would be 2 weeks prior. So best case scenario, December 9th, they would have the grand jury convene for the investigation. How could they possibly know that somebody crossed the state lines if, like the court record now states, the IGG results didn't come back until December 19th? They couldn't have known that anybody crossed state lines to commit this before December 19th, when the IGG came back from their own perspectives. So what is the answer? Is how could they have any evidence someone crossed the state lines to commit the Idaho atrocity on December 9th, 2022? Based on everything that they state publicly, that answer is impossible. I think you would agree with me on that if you've kept an open mind to this point. So once again, law enforcement states, day one, this is a targeted attack. In each of the targeted rooms, one of the victims has a parent that just had major drug charges reduced for working as a confidential informant. As an investigator in the case, you are the investigator. You have this information. Where do you focus your efforts on? Do you go for the frat boys and ex-boyfriends? Or do you go for thugs involved in organized drug crimes, and then you let the community know it's okay, this is a targeted attack, nobody's in danger? And then finally, please answer that, either A or B, in the comments below, by the way. And then finally, was the federal grand jury convened to investigate, or I could say this another way, what was the federal grand jury convened to investigate? Do you believe it was 1, cyberbullying, 2, terrorism, 3, large-scale fraud, or 4, interstate drug trafficking? And I'm not even going to ask the other question, which is, Do you believe the federal grand jury was already convened investigating interstate drug trafficking like I do? But if you kept an open mind through everything that I just showed you, and you can't answer that question right there, number 4, then you don't have a POV block or a Gilter block. You really are dense. Now, you may notice that I'm a little bit fired up this morning, and the reason for that is I have another video that I'm going to put out right after this one, and it's on the court docs, because I found something in the recent court docs that has really upset me. I mean, it has really upset me. And I've located one of the discovery items that the prosecution has not provided the defense as it relates to the DNA, and it is one of the most important discovery items that the defense can have as it relates to the DNA entirely, and it should have been one of the first things produced by the prosecution. So yeah, I am ecstatic. And that brings me to my final point before I get into that. That'll be the next video. But my final point is this. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that through the court docs, the FBI agent identified the vehicle in the neighborhood as a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra. Like I said in my last video, I have been contending that that last pass of that vehicle was Kohberger. I no longer believe that. Based on that identification, if he identified the first 3 passes, he would have had to identify the last pass of that vehicle as the same vehicle. So that means that wasn't Kohberger's vehicle at all in that neighborhood. There's other evidence in the court docs that suggests that maybe Kohberger was at Emma Bailey's house at a different time, going in a different direction, which is fine, but that doesn't put him in the King Road neighborhood. So if that's not Kohberger's car in the King Road neighborhood per the FBI agent, then folks, that ain't Kohberger. Okay? That means that guy is innocent, sitting there in the jail for almost 2 years now. Yeah, think about that. But then I've got these people out here that are either guilters, which you got to understand guilters, they have guilter blocks. But then I got these other people out here that want to fight and demean and argue over. They say they believe Bryan Kohberger is innocent, but they're literally fighting and arguing over clicks and views over frat boy theories. Come on, man. Give me a break. Now, this is the last thing I'm going to say about this frat boy stuff, because I heard one talking about how the university would protect because of the purchase of the Phoenix online school, they would protect the university from all of the bad press by protecting their own students that have committed an unaliving. And give me a break. That is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in my life. You can bet those locals there, including Scott Green, they try to suppress as much information in this case as they can. But it has nothing to do with some frat boys committing an atrocity. It has to do with something that would actually hurt that town. You see, once those unalivings happened, it doesn't matter if it's frat boys or anything else. They're going to try to get somebody in custody, quell the thoughts of everybody around them so that it doesn't hurt their enrollment. They're not going to risk it over protecting some even well-connected frat boys. I'm sorry. And then when you get a federal grand jury investigation involved, the feds, they had 70 federal agents down there. They have no ties to the frat boys, I assure you. In fact, those federal agents were probably ostracized by frat boys when they were in college, so they have no ties to them. But when you think about it from that perspective, they're not going to allow the university to protect frat boys, okay? But they will allow the university to protect itself from organized drug crimes happening on their campus, because those are federal crimes. And they don't want the greater population at large to know about those, so they would allow the universities to suppress that. So think about it. And the fact that anybody suggests that the university is going to protect the frat boys who just unalive 4 people and hope they never do it again because they're in a frat of their university. But then Washington State University could care less about one of their teachers' aides being set up and for that atrocity because they're helping out Moscow PD because they don't want the frat boys to be in trouble. Give me a break. Let me tell you, folks, frats are not secret societies. Frats are not secret societies. I've heard people talk all the time about frat boys in secret societies. And then they'll bring up like Skull and Bones. Skull and Bones, folks, that is a secret society. All of those things like Skull and Bones are secret societies. Guess what? They are totally separate from the fraternities. Now, the people that are selected for things like Skull and Bones are usually selected from a fraternity, but they're selected from multiple fraternities. So the fraternity itself is not a secret society. It's a group of college kids, usually well-educated college kids that have pretty good grade point averages or play sports. It's basically a group of nerds. I mean, that's what it is. We used to fight them all the time when I was in college. I mean, they weren't even very good fighters. Now, if you got a hold of one of those wrestlers, you know, you're in trouble. But they're a group of nerds. So, I mean, it's just freaking ridiculous. And I'm sorry I just went on a rant about all that, but I just hear this stuff out there and I'm going, come on, man, this guy's life's in danger. Y'all are fighting and clawing at me because I'm trying to bring truth to the light because y'all want to talk about frat boys and the university protecting the frat boys. The frat boys are not going to hurt the university's enrollment any more than having 4 of their students unalived on their campus will, I assure you. But having 4 students unalived on their campus because of organized drug crime retaliation hits, that would decimate that town. That would absolutely stop that purchase of the University of Phoenix that they were in the process of buying right then. That would be the only thing that would impact that even more than a 4-person unaliving on their campus. Protecting the frat boys. That is... Anyway, I've got some Discovery docs that I'm about to show you here in a minute that have really got me mad. So when I'm mad, I start talking about all the things I'm mad about. I'm sorry. But please like and subscribe to the channel. Post your comments, thoughts, criticisms. Till next time, Pavarotti's out.